September 1943. The train rattled across the Canadian prairie, carrying 350 German prisoners of war toward an unknown future. Werner Schmidt pressed his face against the cold window glass and watched the endless flat land roll past. He had been a soldier in North Africa. He had fought in Sicily. He had seen his friends die in the desert sand. Now he was a prisoner, and he expected to die too. The Nazi officers had told Werner many things before the war. They said the Allies were cruel. They said the British and Americans would torture German soldiers. They said prisoners would be starved, beaten, and worked to death in labor camps. Werner believed every word. Why would his leaders lie? He had seen the propaganda posters showing evil Allied soldiers with twisted faces. He had heard the radio broadcasts warning of Allied prison camps where men disappeared forever. As the train slowed down near a place called Medicine Hat in Alberta, Werner prepared himself for the worst. The other prisoners sat quietly in the rail car. Some were young, barely 18 years old. Others were older men with gray in their beards. All of them wore the same look of fear. They had surrendered to the Canadians 2 months ago. Since then, they had been shipped across the Atlantic Ocean in the dark hold of a transport ship. They had not seen sunlight for weeks. They had eaten thin soup and hard bread. They expected nothing better now. Werner thought about the stories he had heard. German prisoners in Russia were shot or sent to freeze in Siberia. That is what the officers said would happen to Germans caught by the Allies too. He touched the Iron Cross medal hidden in his pocket. His mother had given it to him when he left for war. He wondered if he would ever see her again. He wondered if she would ever know what happened to him. The train stopped with a screech of metal on metal. Guards opened the doors and shouted in English. Werner did not speak much English, but he understood the order to get out. He stepped down onto a wooden platform and looked around. The sky was huge and blue. The air smelled clean, like grass and wheat. Mountains rose in the far distance, purple against the horizon. It was beautiful, but Werner did not trust it. Beautiful places could hide terrible secrets. The guards lined up the prisoners and began marching them down a dirt road. Werner expected to see guard towers soon. He expected to see thick stone walls topped with barbed wire. He expected to see machine guns pointed at them from every direction. Instead, he saw farms. He saw cows grazing in green fields. He saw a small town in the distance, maybe 2 miles away. Smoke rose from chimneys. People walked on the streets. It looked normal. It looked peaceful. It looked wrong. After 20 minutes of walking, they reached the camp. Werner stopped and stared. His mouth fell open. Next to him, another prisoner named Klaus whispered a curse in German. The fence around the camp was only 4 feet high. A child could climb over it. There were no guard towers. There were no searchlights. The guards walking beside them did not carry rifles. They carried nothing but wooden clubs on their belts. Some of them were smiling. Werner looked at the fence again. It was made of simple wire mesh, the kind farmers use to keep chickens inside. He could see through it easily. Beyond the fence, the Canadian prairie stretched forever. No walls, no barriers, just open land and the road leading back to town. Where were the machine guns? Where were the dogs? Where were the soldiers with guns ready to shoot anyone who moved? The gates opened and the prisoners walked inside. Werner felt his heart pounding. This had to be a trick. Maybe the real prison was underground. Maybe they would be taken to cells below the earth where no one could hear them scream. Maybe the Canadians were clever and hiding their cruelty behind false kindness. He had been trained to never trust the enemy. But as they walked through the camp, Werner saw wooden barracks that looked new and clean. He saw windows with glass that was not broken. He saw a building with steam rising from it, probably a kitchen or a bathhouse. He saw other prisoners already living here, walking around freely, talking to each other, even playing cards at a wooden table outside. They did not look starved. They did not look beaten. They looked healthy. They looked almost normal. A Canadian officer stood near the main building. He spoke to them in German, translated by another prisoner. The officer explained the rules. Wake up at 7 in the morning. 3 meals every day. Clean your barracks. You can work on farms if you want and earn 50 cents each day. You can write letters home once a month. You can attend church services on Sunday. The rules sounded too good to be true. Werner waited for the other rules. The real rules. The ones about punishment and torture. But the officer just smiled and walked away. The guards began showing prisoners to their barracks. Werner followed, still waiting for the trap to spring shut. He walked into a long wooden building with rows of beds. Each bed had a mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets. A small stove stood in the middle of the room to provide heat. Windows let in sunlight. The floor was swept clean. Klaus sat down on a bed and touched the blanket. It was thick wool, not the thin rags they had in the army. He looked up at Werner with confused eyes. Werner understood. Nothing made sense. This was supposed to be a prison camp. This was supposed to be hell. Instead, it looked better than the barracks they had lived in as German soldiers. It looked better than many German towns after the British bombs fell. It looked safe. Werner walked to the window and looked out at the fence again, 4 feet high. No guards watching. The town visible in the distance. He could walk out right now. He could climb that fence in 5 seconds. He could run toward the mountains and disappear. But where would he go? And why did the Canadians make it so easy? What kind of prison had no walls? What kind of enemy treated prisoners like human beings? Werner did not have answers. He only had questions, and those questions frightened him more than any fence ever could. The dinner bell rang at 6 o'clock that first evening. Werner and the other new prisoners lined up outside the mess hall, still nervous and uncertain. They shuffled forward slowly, expecting to receive small portions of watery soup or stale bread. That is what prisoners ate in every story Werner had heard. That is what German soldiers ate when supplies ran low in North Africa. Sometimes they went days with only hard crackers and bitter coffee. Sometimes they shared 1 can of meat between 5 men. Werner picked up a metal tray and moved through the line. A Canadian cook placed a thick slice of roasted beef on his plate. Another cook added mashed potatoes with a big spoonful of brown gravy. Another added carrots and green beans. Another placed 2 pieces of white bread with real butter on the side. At the end of the line, a prisoner working in the kitchen poured fresh milk into Werner's cup. Werner stared at the tray in his hands. The beef alone was bigger than any meat portion he had seen in 2 years. The potatoes were hot and steaming. The butter was yellow and soft, not the gray margarine substitute they ate in Germany. He sat down at a long wooden table with Klaus and several other new arrivals. Nobody spoke. They just ate. The beef was tender and tasted like home cooking, not the tough canned meat from army rations. The bread was soft inside with a crispy crust. The milk was cold and sweet. Werner ate every bite and felt his stomach fill up for the first time in months. When he finished, he noticed other prisoners going back for seconds. He stood up and walked back to the line. The cook smiled and gave him another piece of bread. No one stopped him. No one counted how much he took. That night, lying on his clean mattress under thick wool blankets, Werner could not sleep. His mind kept returning to the same thought. The guards had told them each prisoner received 2,800 calories of food every day. Werner did not know much about calories, but he knew it was more than German soldiers got, much more. During the retreat from North Africa, Werner and his unit survived on 1,500 calories a day, sometimes less. They felt hungry all the time. Their uniforms hung loose on their bodies. Some men got sick from lack of food. Now, Werner was a prisoner eating better than he had eaten as a free soldier fighting for Germany. The next morning, a Canadian officer asked for volunteers to work on local farms. The farmers needed help bringing in the wheat harvest before winter. Any prisoner who worked would earn 50 cents for each day of labor. The money could be used to buy small things from the camp store like tobacco, writing paper, or chocolate bars. Werner raised his hand. He wanted to see more of this strange place. He wanted to understand what was happening. A truck drove Werner and 12 other prisoners out to a farm 5 miles from camp. The farmer was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He shook hands with each prisoner and showed them what to do. They spent the day cutting wheat with machines and loading bundles onto a wagon. The work was hard but not cruel. The farmer brought water to them every hour. At noon, his wife came out to the field with a big basket. She spread a blanket on the ground and laid out sandwiches made with thick slices of ham, apples, cookies, and lemonade. She smiled at the prisoners and told them in simple English to eat as much as they wanted. Werner sat in the wheat field eating a ham sandwich and drinking cold lemonade. The sun was warm on his face. The prairie wind blew gently across the grain. The farmer sat nearby, talking with his wife, not watching the prisoners like guards. Werner realized something shocking. He could run right now. He could drop the sandwich and run toward the distant mountains. Nobody would catch him. The farmer had no gun. The truck keys sat in the ignition. But Werner did not run. Neither did any of the other prisoners. They just sat and ate lunch like normal workers, not captured enemies. Over the following weeks, Werner discovered more impossible things. The camp had hot showers with soap that smelled like pine trees. The water ran hot for as long as you wanted. In the German army, soldiers sometimes went weeks without bathing. Here, prisoners could shower every single day. The camp also had a swimming pool built by earlier prisoners. On hot afternoons, men swam and splashed like children. Guards sat nearby reading newspapers, not caring if prisoners enjoyed themselves. There was a theater, too, where prisoners put on plays and concerts. Some men were musicians before the war. They performed German folk songs and classical music. Canadian families from town came to watch and clapped politely. After one concert, an older Canadian woman approached Werner and asked in broken German if he wanted books to read. She returned the next week with a box full of German novels and poetry. She said her church group wanted to help the prisoners feel less lonely. Werner took a book and thanked her. He did not understand. Why would the enemy's church try to comfort German prisoners? The strangest part was that nobody escaped. The fence stayed at 4 feet high. The guards still carried no guns. The road to town remained open and visible. Werner heard stories of one prisoner who walked away in October, but he came back 3 days later on his own. The man said he got cold and hungry sleeping in the woods. He said the camp was better than being free and alone in a foreign country. The guards welcomed him back without punishment. They just told him not to leave again. Werner began to notice how the other prisoners acted. Men who had been here for months seemed comfortable, almost happy. They worked on farms and saved their money. They wrote letters home to Germany. They played soccer on a field behind the barracks. They argued about politics and music and normal things. They did not act like prisoners waiting to be tortured. They acted like men waiting for the war to end so they could go home. One November evening, Klaus asked Werner a question that had been growing in both their minds. Why would anyone escape from this place? Where would they go? Canada was huge and empty. The winters were brutal. They had food here, shelter, safety, and even friendship with some of the guards and farmers. If they escaped, they would be alone, cold, hungry, and hunted. If they stayed, they were warm, fed, and treated with respect. Klaus said it did not make sense. Werner agreed. Nothing about this place made sense. But the more time passed, the more Werner began to understand a terrible truth. Maybe the propaganda had been wrong. Maybe the lies were not coming from the Allies. Maybe the lies came from home. December arrived with cold winds and snow that covered the prairie in white. Werner had been a prisoner for 3 months now. He worked on the farm 4 days each week and earned $2 that he saved in a small tin box under his bed. He had written 3 letters home to his mother in Hamburg, though he did not know if she received them. The war news that reached the camp was not good for Germany. The Allies were winning in Italy. The Russians were pushing back in the east. Some prisoners talked quietly about whether Germany could still win. Others refused to discuss it at all. The Canadian Guards began preparing for Christmas in early December. They brought a tall pine tree into the main hall and let prisoners decorate it with paper chains and stars cut from tin cans. Werner watched younger prisoners laugh as they hung ornaments. He remembered Christmas before the war, when his family had a tree in their small apartment. His mother made cookies shaped like stars. His father sang old carols in his rough voice. That felt like a lifetime ago, like a memory from someone else's life. One morning, the camp commander made an announcement. Local families from Medicine Hat wanted to invite prisoners to Christmas dinner in their homes. Any prisoner who wanted to go could sign up. The families would come to the camp on Christmas Day and take small groups of men back to town for the afternoon. Werner listened with suspicion. This had to be some kind of test. Maybe the Canadians wanted to see who would try to escape. Maybe they wanted to separate prisoners and interrogate them. He decided not to sign up, but Klaus signed up immediately. So did many others. They seemed excited, almost happy. Klaus told Werner he was being foolish. These people had shown nothing but kindness for 3 months. Why would they suddenly turn cruel on Christmas? Werner had no good answer. He just felt afraid to trust what seemed too good to be true. Still, something inside him was curious. He added his name to the list at the last minute. Christmas morning came cold and bright. Fresh snow sparkled in the sunlight. After breakfast, Canadian families began arriving at the camp in trucks and cars. They were ordinary people, farmers and shopkeepers and teachers. Women wore their best dresses. Children pressed their faces against car windows, excited to meet the German prisoners. Werner felt strange seeing children treat this like an adventure instead of something dangerous. A family named the Johnsons chose Werner and Klaus. Mr. Johnson was a wheat farmer with big hands and a gentle smile. Mrs. Johnson had gray hair and a warm laugh. Their 2 daughters were teenagers who giggled and whispered to each other. They all climbed into the truck and drove into town. The girls asked Werner questions in slow English. Did he like Canada? Was the food good? Did he miss Germany? Werner answered carefully, still not sure this was real. The Johnson house was small but comfortable. A fire burned in the fireplace. The Christmas tree in the corner had real candles on its branches. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air. Mrs. Johnson showed Werner and Klaus where to wash their hands, then invited them to sit at the dining table. The table was covered with a white cloth and set with china plates that looked expensive. Werner felt nervous touching anything. When Mrs. Johnson brought the food to the table, Werner stopped breathing for a moment. There was a whole roasted turkey, golden brown and bigger than any bird he had seen in years. There were bowls of mashed potatoes swimming in butter. There were sweet potatoes covered in brown sugar. There were green beans with almonds. There was stuffing with herbs. There were fresh rolls still hot from the oven. There were 3 different kinds of pie for dessert. Werner tried to count how much food sat on that table. It was enough to feed his entire unit in North Africa for a week. Maybe more. Mr. Johnson said a prayer thanking God for the food and for bringing everyone together safely. Then he began carving the turkey and passing plates. Werner received a slice of white meat as big as his fist, plus helpings of everything else. The daughters poured gravy over his potatoes and offered him cranberry sauce. Mrs. Johnson made sure his plate was full, then told him there was plenty more if he wanted seconds. Werner ate slowly, tasting everything. The turkey was moist and tender. The potatoes were creamy. The sweet potatoes tasted like candy. Everything was perfect. After dinner, the family gave Werner and Klaus small gifts wrapped in colorful paper. Werner opened his package and found a wool scarf, a bar of chocolate, and a small book of English phrases to help him learn the language. The daughters had made the scarf themselves, knitting it in red and white stripes. Werner held the soft wool in his hands and felt something break inside his chest. These people did not know him. He was their enemy. His country was trying to kill their allies. His leaders said these people were inferior and cruel. Yet here they sat, sharing their best food, giving him gifts made by hand, treating him like a welcomed guest instead of a dangerous prisoner. Klaus was crying quietly, tears running down his face. Mr. Johnson put a hand on his shoulder and said something kind in English. Werner did not cry, but he felt like he might. He felt like everything he believed was crumbling into dust. The Nazi officers had told him the Allies would torture prisoners. They said the British and Americans and Canadians were monsters who hated Germans. They said the enemy had no humanity, no kindness, no mercy. But Werner had been a prisoner for 3 months, and nobody had hurt him once. Instead, they fed him better than his own army ever did. They paid him for his work. They let him swim and read and watch plays. Now they invited him into their homes and gave him gifts at Christmas. That night, back in his barracks, Werner lay awake thinking. He thought about the numbers that haunted him. Each prisoner at the camp received 12 pounds of food every week. 12 full pounds of meat, bread, vegetables, milk, and fruit. When Werner was fighting in North Africa, German soldiers received 3 or 4 pounds of food each week, sometimes less. The prisoners ate 3 times more than the soldiers. The prisoners, the captured enemies, ate better than the men still fighting for Germany. How could that be? How could the enemy feed their prisoners more than Germany fed its own army? Werner thought about his mother in Hamburg. The British were bombing German cities now. Food was scarce. People stood in long lines for small rations of bread and potatoes. His mother was probably hungry right now, while Werner sat in Canada with a full stomach and a new wool scarf. The contrast made him feel sick. He had been told that Germany was strong and the Allies were weak. He had been told that German soldiers were superior and the enemy was inferior. But everything he saw proved the opposite. Canada had so much food they could give it freely to prisoners. Germany had so little that soldiers went hungry. Werner pulled out a small notebook and pencil he had bought from the camp store. He began writing his thoughts down, something he had never done before. He wrote, "I have been a prisoner for 3 months, and I have eaten better here than I ate in 2 years as a soldier for the Führer. The Canadians treat us like human beings. They give us dignity. They show us kindness. We were told they would torture us. We were told they were cruel. Every word was a lie." He kept writing, the words pouring out. If they lied about this, what else was a lie? If the enemy treats prisoners with more humanity than our own leaders treated us as soldiers, then who is really civilized? Who is really superior? I do not know what to believe anymore. I only know that I was supposed to hate these people, but I cannot. They have shown me more kindness in 3 months than I saw in 3 years of war. Werner closed the notebook and hid it under his mattress. He felt afraid of his own thoughts. Questioning the Führer could get a man killed, even here. But he could not stop the questions from coming. The fence around the camp was only 4 feet high because the Canadians knew the truth. Prisoners did not want to escape. Why would anyone run away from kindness and abundance to return to a world of lies and hunger? The real prison was not here in Canada. The real prison was the one built inside Werner's mind by years of propaganda. And these kind, generous people had set him free from it without even trying. The war ended in May 1945. Werner heard the news in the camp mess hall while eating breakfast. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The fighting was finally over. Some prisoners cheered. Others cried. Many sat in silence, not knowing what to feel. Werner felt numb. He had been a prisoner for almost 2 years. In that time, he had learned English. He had saved $23 from farm work. He had written 16 letters home, though only 3 replies ever came back. He had spent 2 Christmases with the Johnson family. He had become a different person than the frightened soldier who arrived in September 1943. The Canadians did not send prisoners home right away. There were millions of soldiers and prisoners scattered across the world. Ships were needed for other things first. Werner stayed at the camp through the summer and fall of 1945. He kept working on Mr. Johnson's farm, cutting wheat and repairing fences. He kept saving money. He kept writing letters to Hamburg, begging his mother to respond. Finally, in January 1946, a letter arrived. His mother was alive. Their apartment building had been destroyed by bombs, but she survived. She was living with Werner's aunt now, in the part of Hamburg that was less damaged. She wrote that food was very scarce. She wrote that the city looked like the surface of the moon, nothing but rubble and burned buildings. She wrote that she could not wait to see her son again. In March 1946, the Canadian government announced that German prisoners would begin returning home. Werner received papers showing his time at the camp, his work record, and a letter from Mr. Johnson stating that Werner was a good worker and an honest man. The Johnson family came to say goodbye. Mrs. Johnson cried and hugged Werner like he was her own son. The daughters gave him a package of food for the journey. Mr. Johnson shook his hand and said Werner would always be welcome in Canada if he ever wanted to return. Werner thanked them in English, then in German, then found he had no more words. He just held the package and tried not to cry. The train carried Werner and hundreds of other prisoners across Canada to the Atlantic coast. Then they boarded a ship that would take them back to Europe. The voyage lasted 2 weeks. Werner stood on the deck and watched the ocean waves. He thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the 4-foot fence that nobody wanted to climb. He thought about Christmas dinners and swimming pools and hot showers. He thought about getting paid 50 cents a day to work alongside farmers who treated him with respect. He thought about all the propaganda that said the Allies were monsters. Every single word had been a lie. The ship arrived in France, and the prisoners were transferred to trains heading east into Germany. As the train crossed the border, Werner pressed his face to the window, just like he had done 3 years before. But this time, what he saw made his heart sink. Germany was destroyed. Every city they passed showed the same scene. Buildings blown apart. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Factories reduced to twisted metal and broken bricks. Empty fields where forests used to grow. People walking through rubble, their faces thin and hungry and gray. This was not the strong, superior nation that the Führer had promised. This was a broken, defeated country that had lost everything. The train reached Hamburg in early April. Werner stepped onto the platform carrying his small bag of belongings. Inside the bag were his work certificates from Canada, the letters from the Johnson family, the wool scarf the daughters had knitted, and 2 packages of food he had saved from the voyage. He also carried the notebook where he had written his thoughts over 2 years. Every page was filled with observations about Canada, about kindness, about the lies he had been told. Werner walked through Hamburg and could barely recognize his own city. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by mountains of rubble. The beautiful churches were hollow shells with no roofs. The streets were filled with people who looked like ghosts, thin and pale and desperate. Children begged for food. Old women dug through trash, looking for anything useful. The smell of smoke and decay hung in the air. Werner clutched his bag tighter and kept walking toward his aunt's address. When he found the building, his mother was waiting outside. She looked so much older than he remembered. Her hair had turned completely gray. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles. Her clothes hung loose on her thin frame. But when she saw Werner, her eyes filled with tears and she ran to him. They held each other and cried in the street. His mother kept touching his face, his arms, his shoulders, as if making sure he was real. She said she thought he was dead. She said so many mothers had lost their sons. She said she prayed every night that he would come home. Inside his aunt's apartment, Werner opened his bag and gave his mother the packages of food. There were crackers, dried meat, canned vegetables, and chocolate bars. His mother stared at the food like it was gold. She said they had been living on bread rations and watery soup for months. Sometimes they ate potato peels and turnips. The chocolate bars made her cry again. She said she had not seen chocolate since before the war started. Werner watched her carefully divide the food into portions to make it last. He felt sick remembering the mountains of food in the Canadian camp, the turkey dinners, the second helpings nobody counted. Over the following weeks, Werner tried to adjust to life in Hamburg. He searched for work, but found nothing. The whole economy was destroyed. Factories were bombed. Offices were rubble. Even finding food was a daily struggle. People stood in line for hours to receive small rations of bread and grain. Werner used his Canadian money to buy extra food on the black market when he could. His mother asked how he had money. He told her about the farm work in Canada. He told her about being paid 50 cents a day. He told her about the treatment prisoners received. His mother listened with wide eyes. She said the radio had told them that German prisoners in Allied camps were tortured and starved. She said the newspapers showed pictures of suffering prisoners. Werner laughed bitterly. He said it was all lies. He said he ate better as a prisoner in Canada than he ever ate as a German soldier. He said the Canadians treated prisoners with more dignity than German officers treated their own men. His mother did not know what to say. She just shook her head and whispered that everything had been lies. Werner met other returned prisoners from Canada in the streets of Hamburg. They recognized each other somehow, maybe by the healthy look in their faces or the different way they carried themselves. They gathered in destroyed buildings and talked quietly about their experiences. All of them told similar stories, kind families, abundant food, respectful treatment, 4-foot fences that nobody wanted to climb. They talked about how the propaganda had been backward. The enemy turned out to be more civilized than their own country. Some men said they wished they could return to Canada. Others already had plans to emigrate as soon as possible. Werner kept writing to the Johnson family. He sent letters describing the destruction in Germany, the hunger, the struggle. The Johnsons sent back packages of food and clothing. They sent medicine for his mother. They sent hope in the form of kind words and promises that things would get better. In 1951, Mr. Johnson wrote asking if Werner wanted to immigrate to Canada. He said he could sponsor Werner and help him get a visa. Werner showed the letter to his mother. She told him to go. She said there was nothing left in Germany for young men. She said he should build a new life in a place that had shown him kindness. Werner went to Canada in 1952. He worked on the Johnson farm for 3 years, then bought his own small farm nearby. He married a Canadian woman and had 2 children. He brought his mother to Canada in 1958, and she lived with his family until she died peacefully in 1967. In the 1960s, Werner sponsored his nephew from Hamburg to immigrate. The nephew became a teacher. Werner's children grew up speaking both German and English, knowing both cultures, but calling Canada home. In his old age, Werner often told his grandchildren about his time as a prisoner of war. He showed them the wool scarf, now threadbare and faded, but carefully preserved in a box. He showed them the notebook filled with his thoughts from 1944 and 1945. He told them about the 4-foot fence that nobody wanted to climb. He explained that the real fence was not around the camp. The real fence was inside his mind, built by years of propaganda and lies. He said the Canadians freed him from that fence by showing him simple human kindness. They gave him food and dignity and respect when they could have given him nothing. They treated him like a human being when his own country had treated him like a tool to be used and discarded. Werner died in 1989, 71 years old and surrounded by family in his home near Medicine Hat. At his funeral, his children read from his old notebook. The words were simple but powerful. I went to Canada as a prisoner of war and left as a prisoner of their kindness. The fence was not around the camp, it was in my mind. And they freed me from it. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not force or fear or violence. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply treating your enemy like a human being and letting kindness do what cruelty never could.